We're now about to listen to and understand one of Beethoven's greatest pieces, a big monumental work. It's the Eroica Symphony. To begin with, you have to understand the context in which it was written. Beethoven had finished this ballet, and he wrote this finale based on an Anglaise, this symbol of democracy. And we might think that Beethoven wants to tell people that freedom is important, that democracy is important. Remember, he's in an empire. He's in Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, and so there's nobles and there's people in power. And Beethoven, although he has a von in his name, is really a working man. He's not anybody's servant, but he's a working man. And he wants to talk about this idea that everyone is equal. Perhaps that's his point. And so he finds himself looking on as the French Revolution fights. So at the end of the 18th century, the king and queen of France are overthrown by this mob. And this is the reign of terror. The guillotines came out. Marie Antoinette lost her head. A very violent and bloody revolution. The American Revolution was violent. A lot of people died in the fighting, but didn't have the kind of retribution afterwards. These were people who were starving, and they were angry, and they took their anger out. And so then you had this group of poor people now running the country. It's a true sort of democracy, or at least Republican government, but not very effective. And so rules change, new governments are put in place, and eventually there's something called the directorate, where the power of the little guy is taken away. And it looks like it's going to be like the monarchy again. So maybe what we call an oligopoly, not necessarily based on title, but that people who are poor are going to be disenfranchised again. And it's looking pretty bleak for this ideal in France. The ideal worked in the United States, but in France, it's very fragile. And there's this young officer in the army named Napoleon, and he stages a coup, and he stages the coup to reinstate democracy. That's what he says. And people like democracy are thrilled. Beethoven is thrilled. And so Beethoven actually writes a symphony, which he calls, originally he dedicated it to Napoleon. Now you have to understand, usually when you dedicate a piece, you do it expecting to get something back. You either expect to be paid a little something in exchange for the dedication, or a commission of a new work or something. Well, Napoleon wasn't going to give Beethoven any money. So Beethoven changes it. He dedicates it to somebody in Vienna. And then what he does is he gives it the title, the Bonaparte Symphony, names it after Napoleon Bonaparte. So he's all set. He's excited. And then Napoleon declares himself emperor. Now you know what happened. Napoleon becomes emperor of France. He institutes a draft, so he builds this big army. And then he fights a war in Europe that goes on for many, many years. The United States gets involved in it because that War of 1812, we came in on the side of Napoleon in France against the English. For a brief time, we fought the English. They burned the White House, actually, and then we backed away from that. And France actually beat many countries. The war was raged everywhere. It was raged in Egypt. It was everywhere. But eventually, Napoleon marches into Russia, and the Russian winter defeats him. And after that, his star is on the wane. Let's put it that way. So Napoleon eventually gets defeated. And for many people, this was an emperor who was bloodthirsty, power-hungry, trying to build empire. But for others, he's still a symbol of protecting democracy. Even when he was emperor, he did not allow for nobility to come back. Everybody under him was equal. Of course, they were all equal under him, but there was this idea of citizenry and equality. So Beethoven, at first he hears he's the emperor, and Beethoven gets very angry. And he takes the title page of the work, not the original manuscript, that's been lost, but one of the original printed documents, and he grabs his quill and he crosses the name Beethoven out. He actually crosses it, type Bonaparte out. He crosses out Bonaparte so hard, he rips right through the page. And if you look at the PowerPoint slides that accompanies this, you can actually see a picture of this rip right through this. The manuscript still exists. He ripped it out. He was furious. But his fury doesn't last for long. Apparently, at one performance of the piece, he turned to his publisher and he says, it really is called the Bonaparte Symphony. And there's a real sense that this piece is still dedicated to Bonaparte. But when he first tore out the name, he wrote something to the effect of dedicated to the memory of a great man. So, the great man is the Bonaparte before he was emperor, or something like that. So in any event, we think that this symphony has a lot to do with Beethoven's politics. And probably his audience thought so too, although they may not have known what the actual title was, but my guess is Beethoven let everybody know. So that's the story of the symphony. Now, what is a symphony? A symphony is a piece of music, usually in 4 movements. That means it's got short pieces, and those short pieces are put together to make a longer piece. That's a very common way of writing. String quartets, which has only 4 musicians, often would have a piece of 3 or 4 movements, and that would be one string quartet. Or a piano sonata might have 3 movements. There's one player at a piano. It's called a sonata, but it's made of 3 little pieces, and they go together and form a big piece called a sonata. Symphonies can be any number of movements, but most common is 4. Some symphonies are 3, most are 4. Every now and then you see 5 or 6. In the modern age, we see 1-movement symphonies. But Beethoven's time, 4 was typical. So Beethoven was writing this piece with 4 small pieces, except they're not that small. The first piece, I think, first movement lasts 15 minutes. It's a big monster piece. But he writes this symphony of 4 movements. And so let's talk about these movements. First of all, let's talk about the name. You look at these names, and they're very long. You know, symphony number such and such and such. This is symphony number 3 in E flat major, and then it gives you an opus number, OP number, or a Kirchel number or something, and then it might have a name after, in this case, Eroica. Eroica, by the way, just means heroic symphony. So let me explain this. Originally, a person writes a symphony. That was it. You weren't really thinking about the future. You wrote it for the person who employed you, probably a duke or a king or a prince, and it was played at dinner that Saturday, and the next Saturday you had to have a new symphony. So, composers like Haydn, who were still alive when Beethoven was writing, wrote 104 symphonies. They're just churning these things out. And eventually, a piece might get played more than once, and you had to know what the piece was, because you have to get the music out. Which symphony? Let's do his 12th symphony. So you number the symphonies in order, theoretically. The trouble is that because these pieces weren't necessarily published or anything else, they get lost, and then they get found in attics and weird things like that. So when I was growing up, one of the most famous pieces in the world was the Dvorak New World Symphony. It was Symphony number 5. Well, it's no longer Symphony number 5. It's now Symphony number 9. Symphony number 5 is a different symphony. So if you go to a publisher and say, I want Symphony number 5, you get the wrong music. Unless you go to the PUC library, because we bought our music a long time ago. There, if you go for Symphony number 9, it doesn't exist. Not Symphony number 5 is the correct music. It's very strange. So those numbers don't always work. So then you say, well, what else do we know about a piece? Well, pieces are in a key. You know, there's a C major, D major, C minor. It doesn't matter what a key is. They're just in a key. There's 24 keys. So you then say, well, it's Symphony number 1, which is the one in C major. Now, if you only wrote 6 pieces and they're all in different keys, that makes it pretty easy to identify it. But Haydn wrote 104 symphonies. There are only 22 keys. It's 24 keys. I'm sorry, only 24 keys. So he obviously there's more than one in C, more than one in D. But it helps a little bit. So you would say the Symphony number 3 in E flat major. Finally, somebody catalogs it. In Beethoven's case, you see an OP with a period. That means opus number. Opus is Latin for work. So opus number is like opus number 55 is his 55th work. How do you order it? In the order in which they're published. And that's information you can get. You see the letters that come in. There's files. So then you have the order in which they're published, and you have a good catalog system. Of course, not everything's published. So you also have work without opus, opus posthumous, published after death. It's very confusing. And before Beethoven, publishing wasn't the norm. So there's lots of catalog systems. There's a guy named Hoboken who did the Haydn symphonies, and he's the Hoboken number. And it's a Kirchel number with a K for Mozart. But anyway, you're going to see some abbreviation, some number. That's whatever catalog system, and that helps. But what also helps is either the publisher, who is desperate to sell these things, or the composer, him or herself, sometimes puts a title on a piece. In this case, Eroica. It means heroic symphony. Eroica. Why not heroic symphony? It was named for Napoleon. So we have a symphony name, a key, an opus number, and a title. Now this piece is famous, and Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies. So if you say Symphony number 3, or if you say Eroica Symphony, people know what you're talking about. But if you go to a concert, and remember, you get extra credit by going to a concert, you're going to see these long names. They're very confusing, but now the mystery's gone. There are just lots of ways to make sure we know what the piece is and get the right piece. Now, speaking of which, we break the piece into movements. We have to name the movements, too. But they usually don't have names. So first we put Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we put the speed at which the piece is played. In music, we call that the tempo. I don't know why we do that, but that's the tradition. Now, most pieces, the tempos were in Italian. In ballet, all the words were in French. No one spoke the same language. Even in France, there were 3 different languages. There was Provençal, Languedoc, and then there's the Parisian French. They couldn't understand each other. They're in the same country. So you had to have a universal language because the music traveled throughout Europe, and so Italian was the musical language. Today we'll see music in English, we'll see German, but in Beethoven's time, usually it's Italian. And some of the words are very common. Allegro means lively or fast. You know, andante is kind of a medium tempo. Adagio is slow. Lento is slow. So you can learn a few words. But basically, what they're telling you is there's going to be a fast movement, a slow movement, then a medium movement, and a fast movement. So don't clap till they're all done. The tradition today is we don't clap between movements. There's four movements. Wait till they take those breaks. Four movements at the end. You can clap. It's a fast movement. You know where you are. So that's kind of what the movement titles mean. But you are going to see sometimes some long Italian phrases. They don't mean anything to you. All it really is that there's a movement at one speed, and then there's going to be another movement at another speed. Just giving you some hints. Now let's talk about the first two movements. And we'll talk about the other two later, because right now we're just going to listen to two and then have a discussion on it. So the first movement of a symphony is usually fast. Now it may have a slow introduction to get started, but then it's going to take off. And it's usually 99% of the time in sonata form. Remember that form we talked about last time? You have an exposition with a bunch of themes, sometimes three groups of themes, bunch of themes, and then you have the development where the composer plays and plays and plays and plays. Now we looked at the Prometheus overture where Beethoven skipped that development. He just did the form stuff, the themes. Then a recapitulation where we bring back the themes, maybe with some variation, but we bring them back. And then if the composer wants, they stick a coda at the end. A coda is a tail, and they may stick an introduction at the beginning. Well, that's the standard form for the first movement of almost everything in the classical and romantic era, and that's no different from this symphony. First movement, sonata form. Second movement is usually slow. Lots of forms it can be in. Don't worry about it. The one we're in is a little bit of a hybrid. There's many times you see a theme and variation. And theme and variation means you have a whole melody. It may not even be written by the composer. Maybe a popular tune of the day, maybe by another composer, maybe by the original. And then you write music that's the same length, but it's a variation. And then the same length again. So it's not like a development where we chop things up. It's just the same length as the theme, the same length as the theme, but you're changing the melody each time, changing the music, varying it. And most second movements are that. Some of them are sonata form, usually simplified. Some of them are just song form, which is just A, B, A, or A, A, B, A. Those A's might be pretty complicated, but you have a section, and you have a middle section, then you come back to the first section. And you'll see in the listening maps, I kind of go over the form, because if the form is very easy to follow, it's very polite, very classical, that's a sign of enlightenment thinking, classical thinking, intellectual thinking. If the forms are crazy, that's a sign of the individual, of passion, of romantic writing. And so you notice the first movement of this symphony, you've got no introduction, you've got an exposition, but it's kind of weird. The themes are sometimes very short and very hard to call themes or melodies. And then the development is long. And the development is the stuff where the composer can do whatever he or she wants. It's just long. And then you've got the recapitulation, which is kind of well behaved, and then you have a coda, which is normally just put on for applause, and it's as long as the development. There's no form. Very strange, not very classical. So we have to think about that. We want to think what kind of thoughts are going to lead to democracy, what kind of thoughts are going to lead to fascism. That's what we're trying to figure out here. Very interesting symphony. The second movement is also interesting. In Europe, they used to, I don't know if they still do, but funerals, whenever there's a funeral, the casket would be brought down the street, either to the church or to the cemetery, and behind it there'd be people who'd be drumming. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. This kind of rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. And you hear that rhythm, and you hear it all the time, because these processions go by kind of like we hear sirens today. They were pretty common. And so Beethoven uses this bum, bum, bum rhythm to tell you that the second movement is a funeral march. Now, this again is a romantic idea, that we have an idea that's not musical, a funeral, that's taking over from the musical ideas, which are form and melody. But it's got a funeral march, and then the funeral march gives way to something happier. But the funeral march theme will come back in different guises, and everyone in the audience would have known it's a funeral march because it was bum, 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 bum. We might not know, but Beethoven titled it Funeral March to help us. Now, remember, it's about Bonaparte, but he's still alive. So is it about the soldiers on the battlefield? Is it about the death of democracy? Is it about the suffering that everyone's going to go through to get somewhere? Is it going to be about what happens to a society during revolution? I don't know. If I had an answer to what this piece is about, I'd tell you. But you get to decide, and that's the beauty of music. So you can listen to this first movement with all of its strangeness, and then this funeral march second movement, And then we're going to have some discussion. What does Beethoven mean? Oh, I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you on the discussion board.